Thank you so much, Deb, and thank you all for coming out here. I cannot even begin to tell you how happy I am to see you all in person and not on a computer screen. It's not just the kids in elementary school that are sick and tired of Zoom. I'm here to talk to you all about the situation between the United States and Iran. Iran had its elections earlier in June. A very hardline president was elected, and the nuclear talks that were already in a pretty bad shape are now in crisis mode as a result. But I want to first start off by putting this in a geopolitical context. We have seen on our TV screens for the last couple of weeks what has been happening in Afghanistan. President Biden honored and continued what President Trump already had negotiated, which was to put an end to the US's involvement in the war in Afghanistan and bring the troops home. This was obviously not something that could be done easily. It was clearly going to create some challenges, and indeed some challenges were created at the airport and will continue to exist in Afghanistan. But Biden, I think, did this because there were some profound geostrategic reasons for the United States to extract itself from that civil war, extract itself from many of these endless wars, and dramatically reduce America's military footprint in the Middle East, since it is not adding to our security. At the same time, there's been very strong public support amongst the American public for this decision. Even after the horrible images of what happened at the airport, whether it was a terrorist attack or people falling off of airplanes, support for the withdrawal has been, the latest poll I saw, at 73%. I think it says something about the American public's fatigue with these endless wars. Now, a very key reason as to why Biden chose to go forward with this, knowing very well that this would be quite difficult and that he would get very unfavorable coverage in the media, is because of the need for the United States to not just end these endless wars, bring the troops home, but also start shifting its focus more towards Asia and towards China. In that context, the nuclear negotiations with Iran are key. Because the only major factor that remains right now that could bring the United States into another land war in the Middle East is Iran's nuclear program. Without it being resolved, even withdrawing from Afghanistan will not be sufficient to be able to reduce US's military footprint in the region and in the Middle East and begin a shift towards China and East Asia. This is why this is critical, and why I think at the end of the day, we're going to be hearing quite a lot more about this, because it's quite clear from when you listen to what the president is saying right now, there's some bigger considerations in play. But those bigger considerations have several immediate steps. Fixing the Iran deal is one of those critical steps that needs to be done before we can move on. Now, going back to what happened in the Iranian elections and what's been going on in the negotiations since Biden came in, just a couple of words about what happened before Biden became president. The deal was struck during the Obama years. President Trump rallied against it. It took him about a year before he managed to withdraw from it, reimposed sanctions on Iran, and came with the expectation that all of this added pressure on Iran would force the Iranians to crawl back to the negotiating table and beg for mercy. The exact opposite happened. Instead of the Iranians begging for new negotiations, the Iranians did exactly what many people had predicted. They restarted their program, and many of the things that the deal had managed to put an end to were now reignited, and we were once again gravitating towards a very dangerous situation. So just to give you an example, the Iranians had between 8 and 10,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium stockpile before the JCPOA was concluded in June 2015. As a result of the deal, 98% of that stockpile was shipped out of the country, and they had no longer access to it. You need 1,500 kilos of LEU to produce a nuclear weapon. The Iranians, under the deal, would never be able to have more than 400 kilos of LEU on their soil at one single point in time. Without the LEU, you cannot build the bomb. As a result of Trump reimposing sanctions and walking out of the deal, the Iranians now have thousands of kilos of LEU, once again. They have started enrichment at 20% and even gone up to 80% enrichment of LEU. Everything that the deal had fixed, the withdrawal from the deal has now put back into play. So when Biden came in, there were expectations that he was going to quickly re-enter the deal as he had promised during the campaign. And he had the opportunity to do so, at least move rather quickly. Instead, unfortunately, in my view, he took his time. He did so partly because he wanted to signal to Iran that he's not desperate, and attend to other priorities first. The Iranians, however, perceived his move, particularly mindful of the fact that it contrasted with his rhetoric during the campaign, as him trying to use Trump's sanctions to further weaken the Iranian economy. So by the time the US would go back into the deal, the Iranians would be in an even more problematic situation economically, and as a result would give the US more leverage. Because of that perception, the Iranians decided to even further expand their nuclear program and do things that they didn't even do during the Trump era. So you had a really sad destruction of confidence and trust that put the two countries back in a very, very bad, vicious cycle with almost no, whatever confidence or trust or hope that existed quickly was shattered. Now, after about 3 months, the United States began negotiations with the rest of the P5+1, or the now P4+1, but there were several major stumbling blocks that caused this whole thing to drag out on time. The first thing was, the Iranians refused to directly talk to the United States. Instead, the United States had to go through European mediators in order to be able to convey messages to Iran, and then the Iranians conveyed messages to the Europeans, which was then returned to the US. This dramatically slowed down everything. But it didn't just slow it down. It also meant that the negotiations had major limitations to how far they could go. Because the US side was never going to reveal its bottom line to a mediator. You reveal that to your actual counterpart once you get to that stage. We never got to that stage. Part of the reason why the Iranians refused to negotiate with the US directly was because they were saying, well, the US should go back into the deal, lift all the sanctions, and then there could be talks. If the Iranians talked to the US before, they feared that the Biden administration would use Trump's sanctions and then essentially manage to get more concessions from the Iranians in order for the US to do what it already had been obligated to do. So in order to avoid that, they refused direct negotiations, but that all just led to the talks slowing down even further. There were other obstacles. Trump had done quite a lot to try to make sure that no future administration would ever be able to go back into the JCPOA. He built what he called a sanctions wall. So there were already sanctions on Iran. These were reimposed by Trump as a result of walking out of the deal. Those were sanctions that were all based on Iran's nuclear activity. So they were called nuclear sanctions. So for instance, a specific bank in Iran was sanctioned under these nuclear sanctions. Trump then imposed sanctions on that specific bank or that specific economic activity again, but now on a terrorism basis, and then again on a human rights basis, specifically in order to make it impossible for a next president to lift these sanctions. Because going back into the JCPOA meant that you would lift only the nuclear sanctions. But what's the value of lifting the nuclear sanctions if those very same sanctions continue to exist on a human rights ground or on terrorism ground? Essentially, it would make sanctions relief completely meaningless for the Iranians and take away any leverage Biden or any future president would have in negotiations. It would significantly raise the cost for Biden because now suddenly he would have to justify lifting terrorism-based sanctions and human rights-based sanctions, even though there's nothing the Iranians have done on the human rights front that actually would warrant lifting of sanctions. This was very deliberately done in order to tie Biden's hands. It was even explicitly stated as such in briefings that the White House gave to reporters back then. But then there was also problems on the Iranian side. During this period in which the Iranians were retaliating for these reimposed sanctions and expanded their nuclear activities, they gained new knowledge about nuclear activities and the nuclear fuel cycle. How do you get rid of those? How do you get rid of knowledge that they have gained? So even if you were to go back to exactly how things were when the JCPOA still existed, it would nevertheless be so, but with the Iranians having new, strategically very valuable information and knowledge about the fuel cycle. How do you address that in the negotiations? Whatever the challenges were, towards end of May or so, they were very, very close to an agreement. But the problem was the combination of Biden delaying for 3 months, the Iranians refusing to talk to the US directly. It meant that now everything got entangled with the Iranian elections. On June 18th, the Iranians had their presidential elections. In fact, I'm surprised the Iranians were even negotiating in May at all, or in April. The United States, for instance, would not be engaged in such high-level negotiations in the midst of an American presidential campaign. But here's what happened. Because of this getting entangled in the elections, and because the election results were as they were, we're now in an even worse situation, because now you have a hardline president in power who wants to prove that he can get a better deal than the previous Rouhani government. So he's going to drive an even more hardline bargain than before and make everything even more complex and problematic. But there's a specific lesson here I think we have to really take into account, mindful of how often the US government likes to impose sanctions, or it's ended up becoming the default instrument that we use in foreign policy when we try to coerce countries to do what we want them to do. More often than not, they're actually counterproductive. In the specific case of Iran, the elections of Raisi, the hardline new president, is actually a perfect example of how sanctions undermine the very elements in another country that we should be supporting, and we get the worst type of an outcome from our own standpoint. Let me give you some of the data to back that up. First of all, one clarification. We talk about Iranian elections, but we should be very clear. These are not free or fair elections. The Iranians have a body called the Guardian Council. This body is tasked with vetting candidates and making sure that they are sufficiently acceptable to the system. And as of late, they have been rejecting candidates left and right without even providing a justification for their decision. So you have people who have been former presidents no longer allowed to run. You have had sitting members of parliament, suddenly they're being told they're not acceptable and they cannot stand for election again. This time around, the Guardian Council went even further in its excesses and only allowed roughly 6 or 7 people, 7 candidates to run, of which only 2 were non-conservative. But the 2 that were allowed to run were more or less completely unknown technocrats with no charisma, no following, no base, no name recognition. Everything was done to maximize the likelihood that the elections would go in the direction of Ebrahim Raisi, a hardliner. Now, so for part of the reason why the election turnout was so low, part of the reason is precisely because of this. 4 years ago, when the Iranians were having elections, there was a participation rate of roughly 73%. This time around, 48.78% of the population participated in the elections. Actually, only 42% if you discount the votes that were cast blank or invalid. People who went to vote for a local election and were forced to cast the ballot in the presidential election at the same time and chose to do so by putting in a blank ballot. Some people were also kind of funny. They voted for Batman and other superheroes, but it was a clear sign that they're not willing to cast any vote for any one of these candidates because none of them were acceptable to them. But this was only part of the reason why the turnout was so low. Let me go into why. The Guardian Council actually did the exact same thing in 2013 when Rouhani was elected. Rouhani was also a largely unknown figure in Iran. Outside of the security establishment, the foreign policy establishment, he did not have a following or anything like that. In fact, A week before the elections, he was the token non-conservative that they allowed to run, thinking there's no way he would win. And a week before the elections, polls showed that he only had support of roughly 8.1% of the populace. On election day, 7 days later, he won with 50.71%. In 1 week, he gained another 41 or so percent. How did that happen? Well, it happened because there were a couple of credible figures, former President Khatami, for instance, who ran a big campaign urging people saying, Rouhani is an unknown, but he is the anti-establishment candidate. He is the one that will negotiate with the West. He's the one who's going to be able to fix the economy by improving relations with the United States and getting Iran out of the sanctions and the isolation that it was. And because some of these figures have that credibility, they did manage to get out the vote in a dramatically short period of time. So why could that not have happened this year? Why was it so that 8 years ago, someone that only had 8% in the polls could go and win the elections in the first round, but this time around it couldn't happen? Well, that's where Trump's sanctions and Biden's delay come in. Let me explain. Trump's imposition of sanctions on Iran were absolutely devastating to the Iranian economy. The Iranian economy shrunk 12% between 2018 and 2019. We're not talking about the growth rates slowing down or the kind of things we experienced here during the pandemic. We're talking about actually a contraction of the economy as a whole of 12% in 2 years. This meant that the number of poor people in Iran increased with 10 million, from 22 to 32 million people who ended up in poverty. It meant that the Iranian middle class shrunk from 45% of the population to 30% of the population. And the middle class is the backbone, the core constituency of those who want to see a better relationship between the United States and Iran, who want to resolve the nuclear issue diplomatically. They were the core people who got Rouhani elected 8 years ago. They were the ones that were the most negatively affected by these sanctions that were decimated. Now, what that did is that it didn't just impoverish the Iranian population. It also delegitimized the argument that Iran's economic and political problems can be resolved by reaching an agreement with the United States through diplomacy on the nuclear issue. The idea that if you can just come to a compromise, sanctions will be lifted, was delegitimized by the way that the Trump administration pulled out and reimposed sanctions, and it hit the middle class the hardest. The hardliners in Iran really took advantage of it. For 3 years, they were hammering Rouhani, and their message to the populace was, this is Rouhani's fault. Of course the United States would betray the agreement. It's Rouhani's fault for trusting the United States and putting all of Iran's eggs in the basket of negotiations with the West. And he didn't have a plan B. He didn't have a plan C. And as a result, you are all now impoverished and suffering, and Rouhani never managed to come up with another response to this, because all of his eggs was in the idea of reaching a deal with the United States. This was the message that the hardliners were coming out with over and over and over again during the last 3 years. They didn't blame Trump, they blamed Rouhani. They blamed the very idea of engagement with the West. Now this was not sufficient to be able to convince former supporters of Rouhani, middle-class people who wanted to have an outreach to the United States, to shift sides and suddenly cast a vote for Raisi. Perhaps a small number did, but it wasn't very large. In fact, when you take a look at the numbers, in 2017, when Raisi unsuccessfully campaigned against Rouhani in the elections and lost, he got 15.7 million votes in 2017, 4 years ago. This time around, he got a little bit less than 18 million votes. His vote numbers increased only 2 million. But Rouhani in 2017 got 23.5 million votes. Hemati, who was the candidate that would continue Rouhani's policies, he only got 2.4 million votes. 21 million people who voted for Rouhani this time around didn't vote at all. Not because they had been convinced that Raisi was right, but because they had been convinced that Rouhani and the approach of diplomacy with the West would actually pay off. Having lost faith in that, they had no candidate that they were willing to cast a vote for, and they stayed home. This was made worse because of the fact that the agreement wasn't reached, the JCPOA wasn't restored in the early days of the Biden administration. If it had been done, I think we would be in a quite different situation. You could have most likely have seen a much higher participation in the Iranian elections, and quite likely that there wouldn't have been an Iranian hardline president. But even if it was, if the JCPOA had been restored, the United States would still have been in a much better position, because even if a hardline president were to come in, the JCPOA would still have been there. Now, if he were to choose to walk out of it, it would be massively negative consequences for Iran. But now we're in a situation in which we have to reach an agreement with a new hardline president rather than him just inheriting the deal from the Rouhani government. This has created, as you can imagine, significant difficulties. And where the talks are right now, if we go into the current situation, is that 6 rounds of talks were held prior to June. Since June, there has been no talks at all. The Iranians have not come to the table. They have said that they've had elections and they're trying to figure out who's going to be doing what, things of that nature. Some of it is probably correct, but a lot of it also seems to be some foot dragging. But if they were to come back, and hopefully they will in this month, there will still be 2 major stumbling blocks that remain. And both of them are focused on guarantees, which all go back to the degree of mistrust that has been reignited between the 2 countries. The Iranians are asking for a guarantee of the United States that the United States will not again do what Trump did, meaning go into the deal and then pull out again. This has been devastating for the Iranians, but it's also been devastating for others. European companies, they go into the Iranian economy, and then because the US has an election, and the US changes its mind, all of those companies had to get out of the Iranian market, costing them millions and millions of dollars, $500 million for one Spanish company in particular. This is tremendously costly. So even the Europeans, who otherwise clearly are on the US's side, want to see some form of guarantees. The US response to that request, in my view, has been less than convincing. It's been made an argument that because the United States is a democracy, a US administration cannot tie the hands of a future administration. A future administration must have the ability to make its decision on its own. 2 points on that. Preamble 3 in the JCPOA explicitly says that Iran will never ever build nuclear weapons. Never ever. It doesn't say that the Rouhani government will not build nuclear weapons, but anything is up for grabs if there's a different government coming in. So the Iranians have been asked to make a hard guarantee, and they put it in writing and agreed to that. For us to say that because we are a democracy, we cannot, essentially means democracies are untrustworthy. You should not trust democracies. I think we should come up with a better argument. We should not blame this on us being a democracy. On the contrary, usually the argument is that democracies, because of their transparency, etc., are more trustworthy, more responsible. For us to come and say that precisely because we're a democracy, we cannot offer guarantees, I think is problematic. There are ways this can be resolved. It doesn't have to be guarantees. What can happen is that something can be done, mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that this asymmetric situation that currently exists is made a bit less asymmetric. What I mean by this is that one major problem with the JCPOA was that every country that would leave the agreement would end up paying a very high cost, so high that it would be prohibitive, more or less, and as a result, you had some degree of confidence that they wouldn't cheat, they wouldn't withdraw. That is true for all countries except one, the United States. Because the United States never lifted primary sanctions, there were no American companies going into Iran, because we had no financial stake in the JCPOA, the US could withdraw from the deal, and everyone else would suffer, but not the US itself. If the Iranians were to withdraw, massive sanctions would be reimposed on it. It would be so prohibitive, we weren't even worried about it. Things can be done to even it out a little bit. It will always be somewhat asymmetric. But to have the current situation in which essentially there would be almost no cost paid at all, it is not something that will give confidence to other countries or to the US itself that this is going to be a durable deal. Then the American side is also asking for a guarantee of the Iranians, which the Iranians have refused. The US side wants a guarantee from the Iranians that once the US is back in the deal, the Iranians will agree to renegotiate certain aspects of the deal, the length of the deal, the schedule within the deal. I think, by and large, that is actually a rather reasonable request from the US side, particularly when it comes to the schedule within the deal. So, for instance, 2023, the United States is obligated to lift sanctions in Congress, and in return, the Iranians are ratifying the additional protocol, which then ensures that the inspections regime that has been put in place voluntarily by the Iranians will become permanent and part of Iran's national law. That was negotiated back in 2015. The problem is this: the United States almost never lifts sanctions in Congress. That requires an affirmative vote in Congress. When Obama made a deal with Cuba, for instance, it was only executive orders that were reversed and lifted. Obama did not touch the embargo that actually goes through Congress. So it's going to require a massive amount of political capital for the Biden administration to get sanctions lifted on Iran in a year and a half's time. And to do so a year before US presidential elections is not a particularly attractive prospect for the US side, understandably so. And I think the Iranians too should recognize that if they say no to this request, well, the deal may fall apart in a year and a half time. So what's the point with all of the negotiations right now if it only will last another year and a half? So I think some of these things the Iranians need to agree to as well. The reason they're not is because there's also a request from the US side, or at least rhetorically, we're saying that we want a longer and stronger deal. That's not the schedule within the deal, that is to actually lengthen the deal. Here's the problem of that from the Iranian perspective. The entire essence of the JCPOA was a recognition that the Iranians had violated things that they were not allowed to violate, and as a result, they were not trusted with a nuclear program, and they needed to be in a punishment period for them to prove that their program is fully peaceful and that they don't have any military intentions with it. And once that period, and that period would be roughly 20 years, once they have passed through those 20 years, that's when the prohibition and all the punishments would end, and the restrictions on the program would be gone, and Iran's nuclear program would end up becoming a normalized nuclear program. So the end state is critical for the Iranians. They're going through a period of additional punishment right now to reach that end state. If the US side is saying, we'll come back into the deal, but only if you agree and guarantee that you will agree to extending the punishment period for you with another decade or two, that is not something that I find likely that the Iranians ever will agree to. Because then they will make a lot of requests from the US side of other things the US needs to give. And they're fearing that this is just an effort not to extend it another decade, but to keep on extending it, so that eventually it will be a permanent period of punishment rather than a time-limited period which they have to prove their innocence and they will be out of the doghouse once that is done. So right now, things are not looking particularly great. Both sides have both rhetorically and in substance taken positions that seem to be very difficult to be able to reconcile. And I'm much less optimistic now than I was just a month and a half's time. But I want to leave you with at least a degree of hope, a sliver of hope. And the reason is because at the end of the day, some things gotta give. Because both sides really, really need this deal. The Iranians need it, Raisi needs it, because he's not going to be able to fix the Iranian economy if these sanctions remain in place. It is true that the Iranians now have an option of trading more with China than they did 7 years ago, because the Chinese are now more willing to ignore and defy American sanctions than they were 7 years ago, which is largely a function of a decline in US-China relations. But that is no way, shape, or form sufficient for the Iranians to be able to turn the tide around for their own economy. So the Iranians absolutely need this. And Biden needs this as well, because the largest geostrategic calculations and plans they have in the White House towards right-sizing America's military footprint in areas, geographical areas that are no longer strategically vital to the United States, such as the Middle East, in order to be able to increase the focus elsewhere that actually does matter to the United States. None of that can happen unless the nuclear deal is resurrected first. So that, I think, is a little bit of hope that keeps me alive, keeps me happy, and thinking that they both know how much they need it. It does presume a degree of rationality on both sides, and that is probably the weakest link in that. But I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
What is the lesson from Iran regarding sanctions on the Taliban?
What sanctions are you referring to? Because there's not been any major sanctions imposed yet.
Complete financial restrictions and so forth.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, right now there are voices in Washington that are saying that because the Taliban have not moved forward with having an inclusive government, rather it's all Taliban, or at least Pashto speakers, they're not showing the commitment that they promised to do to make sure that Al-Qaeda cannot operate. Are they dealing effectively with ISIS, etc.? Mindful of their continued human rights violations, that there should be sanctions imposed on the Taliban. That is not a done with issue, though, however. That decision has not been made because there's clear recognition that Afghanistan under our occupation was made a completely dependent state, not that it necessarily wasn't before. And roughly, I think, 80% of the government's budget is coming through aid. If financial sanctions are imposed, that means that no aid will be going to Afghanistan at all. That means that all of the women and girls' schools that we want to see kept open are going to get closed, not necessarily by the Taliban, but because of our sanctions. So a decision has not been made yet. The Biden administration is working on a sanctions review that is due to come out early October, and that is likely to recommend that the United States needs to take much more cautionary approach when it comes to broad-based sanctions, mindful of the immense impact that has on civilian populations. And in this specific case, it would follow the pattern as we've seen elsewhere with Iran, with Iraq, with Cuba, Venezuela, in which it is the general population that will be affected much more so than the governments. I would suspect that Afghanistan would likely be even worse, because so much of the money coming in is aid money that would not be able to come through, and that the Taliban would likely be able to continue to make its own money off of the drug trade that they have been involved in for quite some time. But if the US then doesn't impose sanctions on the Taliban, yes, and I think your question is quite interesting in the sense of how the Iranians will react to that, mindful of the many sanctions that they're subjected to. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Our next question is back here.
Yes, does Iran sponsor terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah?
Yes, Iran is a major supporter of Hezbollah and has been so for quite some time. In the case of Hamas, Hamas was never as close to Iran as Hezbollah was or other Shia organizations were. But in the last couple of years, because of the shift in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, Hamas has lost some of their previous benefactors, which were countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others, and now have moved closer to the Iranians. But it is not the only country that is supporting Hamas. Other countries have also provided some support. The key support that I think the Hamas movement have gotten by the Iranians that probably is more relevant right now, mindful of the immediate impact that it has had, is what we saw in the war just a couple of months ago, this past summer, between Israel and Hamas, which started off with the Israeli throwing out the Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah and making way for settlers to take their houses, which then later on Hamas got itself involved in. that ended up being a very different conflict compared to what existed in 2014 when you had the last bombardment of Gaza by the Israeli military forces. This time around, the number of rockets that Hamas shot into Israel was dramatically higher. They even used drones, technologies that they didn't have a couple of years ago, but which they have today, which largely, if not exclusively, is because of their new relationship with Iran, which didn't exist earlier on.
Our next question is in the center.
Yes, I wondered what your perspective of Tony Blinken is, and is he weak or is Biden just not paying attention to him?
Let me put it this way, I know Tony and I have deep respect for him. I think he's a very impressive person. He and I have some disagreements on larger issues. I don't think this is Tony's fault. I mean, keep in mind, this is the first time since George H.W. Bush that you have such an experienced foreign policy president. Biden has been in the Senate since the early 1970s. He's been the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then he was vice president, and now he is president. He has understandably a view of himself as being more experienced than anyone else in the room on foreign policy because objectively he is more experienced. That doesn't mean that he's not listening to them or anything like that. That's not the argument I'm saying. I'm just saying that when we hear a media narrative saying that Biden doesn't listen or Biden's making these decisions, it's not taking into account that this is not Obama who came in, who didn't have much foreign policy experience except for the fact, of course, that compared to the average American, he had spent much more time outside of the United States. Or George W. Bush, who almost prided himself on not having much foreign policy experience. Or Trump, I'm not even going to say anything about that. So this is a very, very different president. It cannot possibly be easy to be Secretary of State under President Biden or National Security Advisor, because this is an extremely experienced person. Now, it doesn't mean that he's right or wrong. That's not what I'm referring to. I'm just saying this is not usually how it's, or at least this is not what it's been since 1992.
Our next question is in back.
With the new hardline government, is the relationship going to change between Iran and Lebanon? What's currently happening now?
Thank you. I don't think so. On the contrary, Lebanon's dilemma right now is absolutely devastating. This is a state that almost is on the brink of collapse. And Lebanon has always had a weak state. And within that weak state, one of the strongest elements is Hezbollah, which is part of the government. Just in the last week, we've seen that as a major fuel crisis has taken place in Lebanon, fuel is now starting to come in by the Iranians through the Hezbollah connections. I don't foresee that relationship changing at all. And a hardline government would probably invest further in its relationship and alliance with Hezbollah. Not to say that the previous one didn't, but the focus of this government, this Raisi government, will likely be to invest more on China and the East and invest more in their own local allies rather than what the Rouhani government did, which is to look more towards the West, look more towards Europe, and look more towards the United States.
So do you think they will take over much bigger part in Lebanon? Is what
I wouldn't say take over. No, I wouldn't say take over, but the Iranian influence in Lebanon, I don't foresee reducing as a result of this crisis, no.
Our next question is
An unfair question to bring up, but Yemen and Syria, any comments?
Tons of comments. Any specific comments? Could you specify it a little bit?
Well, we've had a lot of news about Yemen and the humanitarian crisis there, but it being a surrogate for Iran in particular, is that going to keep going on?
Thank you. Let me rephrase that question, if you don't mind, a little bit, and look at it perhaps a little bit bigger. You said something very interesting. You said that it is a surrogate for Iran. The Houthi movement has oftentimes been referred to as an Iranian proxy or Iranian ally. That is beyond the simplification. It's actually not entirely accurate at all. Without a doubt, the Iranians are supporting the Houthis. There's no doubt about that. But the war in Yemen started off as an internal Yemeni affair. It's a continuation of a conflict that had existed for quite some time. The Saudi government decided to go in, and they created somewhat of a fake coalition. There were just a couple of states in that coalition that were really active in it, to defeat the Houthis and restore the Hadi government. The Iranians strengthened their relationship with the Houthis during that period, which started already before the JCPOAs in 2014. And there's been a long proxy fight between the Iranians and the Saudis in many places. They've been fighting each other in Iraq, they've been fighting each other in Lebanon, although the Saudis have not quit Lebanon, and certainly fought each other now in Yemen as well by proxies. But the point there is, right now, the key issue to resolving the conflict is that the Saudis need to end the embargo and the blockade, which is causing the main humanitarian crisis. That is not something the Iranians are imposing. This is done by the Saudis. The Saudis have been using a paragraph in the Security Council resolution saying that there should be a check making sure that there's not weapons coming in from the outside into Yemen. That does not justify a complete blockade. That complete blockade is now starving the Yemeni people. It's the worst humanitarian crisis that we're seeing right now. The Saudis have lost in Yemen. It's completely clear. The question is if some sort of a face-saving way can be found for them to lift the blockade and engage in a larger political process and come to some sort of an end to that war, which has been absolutely devastating. The Iranians and the Saudis are actually negotiating directly now, and they have been since January, through Iraqi mediation. There's been some progress in those talks, and the top agenda item in those talks is Yemen. The Saudis definitely need to find a way out of Yemen, and the Iranians have a limited ability of delivering there. Because the Iranians don't have the influence to be able to tell the Houthis, stop firing rockets into Saudi Arabia, for instance. They have an ability to pressure them to stop doing some of it. But the Iranian influence over the Houthis have been overstated by the Saudis themselves. And this was very much a deliberate effort by the Saudis to portray it as just the Iranians as a way of getting more Western support. But in that process, I think they may have started believing it themselves. So they're asking the Iranians to do things that I think some of the Iranians would be happy to do, but they just don't have the influence over the Houthis, because the Houthis are a completely independent organization. Their marriage with Iran is of complete convenience. There's absolutely nothing ideological or deeper there that would allow the Houthis, for instance, to become what Hezbollah became in Lebanon. But there's a bigger issue here that I would like to address, because your question is touching on it. We talked about it earlier this morning during a luncheon in Colorado Springs. You focused on the Iranian influence in Yemen, and again, the Iranians are intervening in Yemen. We have a narrative in Washington for the last 4 or so decades in which we often try to explain the instability in the Middle East by pinning it on a single actor. One single malign actor that is the key problem. And if that one actor just stopped doing what they were doing, everything would be fine. That one actor has shifted. At one point it was Gaddafi in Libya, at another point it was Saddam in Iraq, Assad in Syria, and then for quite some time now, the Iranians. We did a study that just came out about a month and a half, 2 months ago, in which we tested that hypothesis. And we looked at every military intervention committed by any Middle Eastern power in the Middle East itself. We didn't look outside the Middle East, just in the Middle East. We used a scoring system developed by a university in Europe that essentially scores, if you're going in with ground troops, if you're doing a coup d'etat, if you're occupying, different scores to be able to see, the extent of a military intervention. If this hypothesis would be true, Iran would be a complete outlier. Its score would be much, much higher than everyone else. That is not the image that emerged. Again, without a doubt, Iran is one of the most interventionist states in the region. But it is in pretty bad company. There's roughly 6 states in the region that are roughly equally interventionist. Iran, Turkey, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel. All of them pretty much got the same scores. In fact, in the last couple of years, Turkey and the Emirates have been more interventionist than the Iranians. And incidentally, they're not fighting the Iranians, they're fighting each other. The Turks and the Emiratis have fought each other in Libya, for instance, and significantly contributed to the destruction of that country. This was quite surprising because, we were constantly told the malign activities of Iran or the destabilizing activities of Gaddafi, etc. But we were not told about the other activities, all of the other interventions that were conducted by these other states. Within those six, the top tier was Iran, Turkey, and Emirates. The Emirates and Turkey have now actually become greater than that of Iran. The lower tier was Saudi, Qatar, and Israel. And in the case of Saudi and Qatar, it should be noted, they're doing less military intervention because they're paying others to do the intervention for them. They don't have the military capabilities themselves to do so, but they're funding interventions by others. Another thing that came out of this is that if you take a look at these 6 countries, what's the pattern? 5 out of these 6 are armed and politically protected by the United States. Saudi, US strategic partner, as is Emirates, Qatar. Turkey is a NATO member. Israel, of course, is a special ally of the United States. What we have done is that we have obsessed with one specific state that is very interventionist, but it's come at the expense of the interventions on everyone else that we have then turned a blind eye against. And their interventions are actually more destabilizing in total than just that one state. And that's part of the reason why the Middle East looks the way it does, because our focus has been very, very selective. So even as you asked the question, you focused on the Iranian role there, whereas in reality, it's the Saudi role that is the real problematic one in Yemen right now. And the United States is the country that within a week can end that war. Biden promised to do so. He's not done it yet. But within a week we can do so because the Saudis cannot fly their airplanes without the servicing of the US military.
Thank you. Our next question's in the Senate.
Yeah, just going back to Lebanon, with Hezbollah and obviously the Taliban are the best 2 militias in the world, best trained militias in the world, both due to drug money. Do you think that Hezbollah is holding out to drag down the economy, to crash it completely so they can take over completely as a government, kind of a coup d'etat by crashing the economy?
I have to say, I'm not an expert on Lebanon, but it sounds unconvincing to me, and I'll say it for a couple of reasons. I've never heard anyone who I've spoken to about the crisis there, that would be the explanation of it. The other reason is, why would you want to be in control of a completely crashed economy, a state? There's really not much of a benefit. Hezbollah was in a pretty beneficial position before. It was a somewhat functioning state, and they were the most powerful political entity within it. How is that not better than actually crashing the economy and then owning the entire problem, as they would be right now? So I'm not an expert on it, but I've not seen any evidence or any logic that would be compelling to say that would be the case. I think they're suffering tremendously as well right now. And what you have, I think, is that an entire elite in Lebanon is being blamed by the population, not any one single group. I mean, the population's confidence in the elite as a whole, whether it's Hezbollah or whether it's any of the other parties, has just completely come crashing down because they're all corrupt. They're all completely corrupt.
Question for me. Iran has been a very progressive country, offering women broad opportunities for careers and education. With the new government and political trends, how do you foresee that impacting the rights of women?
Thank you. It's a great question. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with the premise, though. In many ways, Iran has been extremely repressive against women. But the picture is complicated, because at the same time, 60% of university students are female. Most professions, you have a very high participation of women as well. So certainly in a Middle East context, you actually see far more women in the Iranian workforce than you would do in Saudi Arabia, for instance. I mean, it's not even comparable. And certainly now what we're going to see in Afghanistan is going to... But at the same time, there's massive problems as well. Inheritance laws are horrible. Divorce laws are certainly stacked against women. So there's massive, massive problems. But to the second part of your question, will it get worse under this new government? I would not bet my money that it wouldn't, in the sense that socially conservative and more strict enforcement of social laws, such as the hijab and things of that nature, is likely going to take place. I don't foresee a particular improvement at all on the human rights front. I think we're going to see more repression. We're going to see more discrimination on many different fronts. Whether that will be specifically just targeting women or whether it will be society as a whole, I think will be more of the latter, but women will most likely, again, be the biggest losers in such a scenario. And again, this is also a very common pattern that we have seen in states that have been exposed to broad-based embargo-like sanctions. What oftentimes happens in those cases is that the government becomes more repressive because that's the way they keep control of power. They have tended to become more adventurous in their foreign policy and in general just become more problematic. I did a study a couple of years ago and we looked at if there is any correlation between embargoes and democratization. We looked at the number of states that have transitioned from 1955 to 2000, I think it was, that transitioned from authoritarian state to a democracy, and there were 35 cases. Out of those 35 cases, 21 had been under some minor form of sanctions, not broad-based at all. 14 had not been, 20 and 14 had not been under any sanctions. One country had been under full embargo, and that was South Africa. We looked at the countries that had been under embargoes. What had happened to those? 10 countries. Out of those 10 countries, only one transitioned to democracy. The 9 others, from Cuba to North Korea to Iraq, etc., all got worse on almost every level. This is part of what the Biden administration is looking at right now when it comes to the use of sanctions. Because sanctions in some ways have actually ended up becoming more devastating than war itself. Part of the reason for that is we have plenty of laws when it comes to how a war can and cannot be conducted. That's not to say that everyone follows those laws, but for instance, it is considered a war crime to bomb civilian infrastructure in a war. There is no regulations at all on what economic sanctions can and cannot target. And economic sanctions tend to overwhelmingly target civilian institutions. So war is more regulated than economic warfare is right now.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Any questions? Thank you.
Not about Tony, okay?
I hear he's a good guy, but I'm waiting to, I'm from the show me state, and I'm waiting for him to show me. Yes, but I was in Iran in 2016, right before Trump was elected, and we all vehemently told, it was from a different World Affairs Council that took a trip over there. It was very fascinating, and it was highly pro-American public at that time. It was astonishing. But there was a very strong anti-theocracy sentiment among just about everyone I talked to. And they were not hesitant to talk about it. I just wondered, with our Trump's brutal era of economic sanctions, if you have any way of gauging, is that still the case? If there's still a strong anti-theocracy feeling among the populace?
Yeah, I think the anti-theocracy feelings are even stronger now than it was before. Because you have to keep in mind that during these years, yes, there were sanctions that made everything worse, but you also had COVID and a massive mismanagement by the Iranian government of COVID. Corruption has increased dramatically. So even under the Rouhani years, right now Rouhani's population, popularity figures are single digits. So it's been absolutely devastating. So I think Trump's actions did not in any way, shape, or form push the Iranian population towards the government. Their anti-theocracy sentiments, I think, are tremendously strong. And again, we saw that in the last elections. There was no reason for them to go and participate in those elections if there's no real options being offered. What I think they're stuck with, which is really depressing, I have to say, is a country that did a revolution 40 or so years ago now is not likely going to do another revolution anytime soon, because revolutions are absolutely devastating. Everything is turned upside down. We have very few examples of revolutions working out in the Middle East. I mean, we pin some hope on Tunisia, but not even Tunisia seems to be living up to the standard of success any longer. And certainly we cannot talk about success in Syria, in Libya, or in Egypt. It's been an absolute disaster. So what do you do in those circumstances? Well, this is why a lot of people voted for the reformists. It wasn't necessarily because of a belief that they're great or anything like that, but the elections were one of the few abilities they had that were low risk, perhaps not high impact, but low risk, in which they could push the government. And almost always the candidate that won was the anti-establishment candidate. What happened here in 2016 happened every 4 years in Europe. The anti-establishment, even Ahmadinejad, when he was elected, was considered the anti-establishment candidate because his counterpart was Rafsanjani, who was one of the key designers of the revolution as a whole. But now, with no options being offered on the ballot at all, even that one small option of being able to risk-free push the government seems to have been taken away from them. And the question is, what will happen in the next couple of years? Is this going to be cemented now? Because if that happens, then yes, then the likelihood of dissent being expressed through other means, violent means, is likely going to increase. It's not necessarily going to be successful. It's more likely going to just fuel even further repression by the government. So they may very well end up stuck in a negative spiral now as a result. I wish you had asked me a question that could give you guys some positive, uplifting, everything is going to be awesome type of answer. But it's not my fault, it's your fault. You have to ask better questions.
Thank you. Please help me in welcoming the